going on, everyone? Welcome to another very exciting episode right here on the MIgardener channel. In today's episode, I'm going to be giving you a few simple ways to test your soil right at home so you can know what the quality of your soil is and what you need to fix. Let's go. So just like they tell you that a healthy body starts with a healthy diet, you are what you eat, right? That also applies to the garden. And your garden starts with healthy soil. Now, healthy soil should be kind of the Goldilocks of the three things that we find in soil, which is sand, silt, and clay. Now, sand, silt, and clay are what makes up all soil. There's also known as organic matter, which is a fourth thing that you'll find sometimes in soil. But having a good balance of sand, silt, and clay is vital to having healthy soil. And the reason why is if you have too much sand, it's going to drain too freely, it's going to dry out too fast. If you have too much clay, it's going to compact, it's going to hold on to water too long. And if you have too much silt, it's going to simply be very dusty. It's not going to hold on to water very well because it's actually very hydrophobic. The water is going to simply beat it and run away. It's also very lightweight, meaning it can blow away if you have high winds and stuff like that. So having the kind of the Goldilocks scenario of just enough but not too much, and you want a good ratio of those three things, sand, silt, and clay. And so these soil tests that I'm going to give you are basically ways that you can test the amount of sand, silt, and clay in your garden. All right, so the first way you can test your soil is through what's known as the sight, smell, feel test. Basically, you can use your senses to tell what good soil actually is. You can use your eyes to look at the soil, you can use your nose to smell the soil, and you can use your fingers to feel the soil.
I gotta sniff the marble. I gotta lick the marble. I gotta wash the marble. I gotta date the marble. I gotta be the marble.
And through those three systems, you should basically be able to tell what the quality of your soil actually is. So the first way is through the sight test, and you should be able to look at the color of your soil. Now you want to look at dry soil because dry soil will be a far different color than wet soil. Here our soil, we just flipped this over, we just harvested our potatoes. It's a little bit damp and we just had some rain, so it's pretty dark. But once this dries out, it's going to change color. And when you look at dry soil, this is dry soil, it should still retain a lot of that dark color. A dark color is the presence of broken down organic matter. That means that there's fertility in your soil. If it's very gray, super gray, it's going to be void of a lot of that life. Now, if it's really, really dark, that's totally fine. You know, you can't really ever get too dark on soil, but you can get too light. Like if it looks very chalky or very like pottery, you know, if you've ever worked with clay, and like I'm going back to like third grade clay class, you know, when you're playing with clay, it's very, very light gray. So the lighter the color, the lighter the shade, the less fertility there's going to be. And so just look for some dark colors and you're going to be good. Now you want to combine that with the smell test. The smell test should tell you if your soil is rich in fertility and rich in organic material, because if you smell it, it should smell like a forest floor. Now, there's some other things you can pick up on. Soil that's heavier in clay is going to smell rather metallic. And so metallic soil is high in minerals, right? Clay is very, very high in minerals, but too much clay and you're going to have an imbalance, right? It's all about the Goldilocks scenario of just enough clay, just enough silt, and just enough sand. And so a very metallic smelling soil could be the presence of too much clay. Could be. It's not guaranteed, but it could be. And so that will be confirmed in the feel test. But if your soil smells very methane-y, right, or like kind of like a swamp, that could be the presence of way too much clay as well, because methane is gathered through moisture that's trapped in the soil, and basically there's bacteria that break down in an environment that is void of oxygen. They break down things like roots and leaves and whatnot. And that methane is the gas that's trapped in the clay layer. So if your soil smells kind of swampy or boggy, that also could be a presence of too much clay, because generally that will mean that there's not enough aerobic movement in your soil. So the smell test means a lot, and it indicates if you have really good aerobic activity, a very good loose, rich soil, and a soil that's high in organic material. Now the field test is just as the name implies, you're going to actually pick up your soil. You want to pick up some soil and put it in between your thumb and your other fingers and basically roll it back and forth. And once that soil has fallen between your fingers, you're left with what's on your fingers. That's the most important component, is what's left on your fingers, because you're not going to really gather a whole lot. You might be able to feel some aggregate, some pebbles, some chunks of wood and stuff as it's falling through. That's fine, you can feel that. But the texture that's left on your fingers is the most important. And that's going to tell you if your soil is very sandy, very silty, or very clayey. It's very high in clay. And so basically what I'm feeling for is I'm feeling for grittiness, right? That grittiness is sand. I'm feeling for kind of a fluffiness, almost like powdered sugar, right? That's going to be siltiness. And then I'm also feeling for sliminess or slipperiness, which is clay. And so I'm feeling for that in my between my fingers. Now, if you have a hard time feeling that slipperiness, sometimes what's nice is getting a little bit of water and actually putting it into some water, because that's going to actually activate some of that clay, which might feel a little slippery. See, I just changed the moisture content and the texture changed, right? So try it dry and try it wet. See if you can tell a difference. See, I'm feeling far less grittiness now than I was. I'm feeling some grittiness, which is good. That's the presence of sand. But I'm feeling a little bit more slipperiness. That slipperiness is the sign, is the presence of clay. And that's actually really good in your soil. You want to actually have clay in your soil, believe it or not. Now, if you're going with just pure compost, we'll talk about that later. But in a garden that is basically like a native soil combined with compost garden, you should have the presence of clay. That means you're gonna have lots of minerals, and minerals are very, very good in your soil. It's just about having not too much of them, right? So there is some slipperiness to it. That's a sign of some clay, but also the siltiness is going to be present when organic material breaks down. So I know that there's going to be some silt in there as well. All right, so the second way of testing your soil is by getting a mason jar of water and actually testing and measuring the percentage, which is going to give you a very accurate measurement of what's actually in your soil. So what you need to do is basically pick the place where you're going to test your soil. I recommend testing from several different locations because it's going to give you a better idea of the overall composition of your soil, because there can be spots with more sand, there can be spots with more clay, and so it's going to give you a good all-around average. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scrape away about 1 inch or 2 of soil. You don't want to test the top of your soil, because if you test the top of your soil, it's going to actually not have the same composition as what your plant roots are actually coming in contact with. Generally, the top of your soil is going to have a lot more silt and potentially a lot more sand than down lower. And so it's going to give you just a better sample size. So get a little bit of soil, tablespoon or so, come over here, scrape it, get about a tablespoon or so. I come over here. You don't really have to, it doesn't really matter necessarily where you're getting your samples from, just making sure that they're tested sporadically throughout your garden about 2 inches below the soil surface, right? Come over here, we can get some more soil. And making sure that the sample sizes are roughly about the same amount for each location, right? And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna throw the lid on and we're gonna shake it up. Now through shaking, what is gonna happen is it's actually going to emulsify all of the three. You're gonna have the sand, silt, and the clay, as well as the organic material, which we'll talk about. But it's going to emulsify everything into the water, and what it's going to do is it's going to settle out, because settling occurs based on particle size. The larger particles are going to be lower, and then the finer particles and the lighter particles, the less dense particles, are going to be higher. All right, so after about 5 minutes or so, you're going to start to see stuff settle out almost immediately. Now you're really going to get a good sample by letting this set about 24 hours. And basically what you're going to find are 3 different bands. And what you can do is you can actually measure those bands. Now it's recommended that you measure in centimeters. Even if you're here in the States and you don't use the metric system, the centimeters is going to be a very accurate measurement of your soil layers. And so what you're going to find is the first layer is going to be your sand layer. And then your middle layer is going to be your silt layer. And then your top layer is going to be your clay. Now the clay is still mixed in with the water. That's why it looks pretty chocolatey. But that chocolate milk is eventually going to turn clear, and that top is going to be the clay. So it's going to form sand, silt, and clay. And then basically what you can do is you can take a ruler and you can measure those individual bands. And so if our measurement, keeping math very simple, let's say we measured this out here and it was about 4 centimeters total, right? You're measuring the sand, silt, and clay total, right from the bottom to the top. what you're going to do is you're going to measure just the sand layer, and you're going to divide that from the total. So if my sand layer was, let's say, 2 centimeters out of 4 centimeters, you're going to find that 50%, doing basic math, 50% of your soil is sand. Then you're going to come up and you're going to measure the top layer, and that, or the middle layer, right? The clay layer. And let's say it's 1 centimeter, keeping math simple because I don't want to mess up here on camera, but let's say that it's just 1 centimeter, right? 1 out of 4 is 25%. And then if you measure the top layer, let's say the top layer is another centimeter or so, you're going to find that that's 25% silt, and or 25% clay, sorry. So you're having 50% sand, 25% clay, and 25% silt. Now those percentages don't really indicate a whole lot until you look at a soil pyramid. So once you have the percentage of sand, silt, and clay from your water test, you can actually use those to compare them on what's known as a soil pyramid. Now, if you've never seen a soil pyramid before, it's incredibly helpful at actually deciding what type of soil you actually have. And so it's a roadmap because there are lines on the soil pyramid based on the percentages of those 3 different ingredients. So you have a silt line, you have a sand line, and you have a clay line. And what you're going to do is you're going to basically go to the percentage of clay first. That's the bottom. You want to start at the bottom, and each point on the pyramid is 100%. And so you start on the bottom and you move to the left of the pyramid, basically finding out what percentage of clay you have. In our soil, we have about 30% clay. Then you want to go to the sand column or the sand side, and you want to follow that line down. And in our soil, we have about 40% sand. And then you go over to the silt side, and the silt side is going to be what percentage of silt you have. And in our soil, we have roughly about 30% silt in our garden. And so we can follow that line across. And the point in which all 3 lines intersect, they won't always perfectly intersect, but the point in which they roughly intersect gives you a quadrant, or like a little bubble within the pyramid that tells you if you have sandy soil, silty soil, clay soil, or a combination of any of those 3. You can have sandy loam, which is loam is basically a perfect combination, the ideal combination of all 3 of those. Then you have sandy loam, you have clay loam, you have silty loam, you have sandy clay, you have silty sand. There's so many different variables, but that is based on what your percentages come up with. And from there, you can actually find out what you need to be adding to your soil to get to that perfect loam ratio. The loam is the ideal kind of soil quality for what's known as an in-ground stable garden. So the thing is that if you're growing with just compost, like I talked about, you're going to find that yes, there will be some sand, silt, and clay found in your soil. Naturally, you're going to have clay coming up from below your beds and stuff like that. But pure compost is going to be a bit of a different style garden because it's mostly organic matter, right? But if you're growing a traditional garden where you're rototilling, or if you just double dig your beds, or you're growing in ground, like right in ground, and you're not bringing any artificial soil, or not artificial, but you're not bringing any like outside soil in, or if you're a farmer growing on several acres, these things are what matters. The organic material, which we'll talk about, is completely separate from this soil test. You want to ideally aim for a loam soil. That's what you want to aim for. So once you know what type of soil you have, the next question is, well, what do I do about it if it's not ideal? And so what you can do is you can amend your soil. Now, amending your soil is basically just changing the characteristic of your soil. And so if you have too much sand in your soil, you might think to yourself, well, I need to add a lot more clay or a lot more silt to my soil. Where do I get clay and where do I get silt? Well, you get clay and silt from outside sources, and you can source them pretty easily from different landscaping companies. Will have something like a fill dirt or a topsoil, which has a higher clay content. The fertility is not going to be there as much as the water retention will be. So this also is assuming you're not going with just compost. Compost has excellent water retention, but compost can be very incredibly expensive. And so what you want to sometimes go with, if you're going on the cheap, is you want to go with something that is inferior quality in terms of fertility, but superior at water retention. And so you can find clay or clay containing soils from basically, from a landscaping company, or you can go there and actually do this test. To test, you can do the site feel smell test on their soil. You can do the water test on their soil, or they might even tell you, yeah, our soil has a little higher clay content in it. And that's what you want to be adding into your soil to increase the overall water holding capabilities, because clay is an excellent material at holding water. Aside from organic material, which we'll talk about. I know all you guys are getting excited on the edge of your seats. Like, when's he going to talk about organic material? I will. But when it comes to just what we are given in our soil, right, the dirt of our soil, the clay can hold on to the moisture. But then there's also something like sand. Well, what if I have really sandy soil, right? What if I have really silty soil? Sand, you don't want to add clay right away to sand, otherwise you're going to make what's known as concrete, right? So you don't want to do that. You want to add silt, right? But silt doesn't just come from anywhere. It comes from compost. It comes from broken down, fully decomposed organic material. That's where the silt comes from. And silt is incredibly important in the garden because silt contains the fertility. And so for that, if you have very sandy soil, I would recommend adding something like compost. If you have a lot of clay, well, you shouldn't add sand to increase the drainage. You should add compost to break up the clay first to add the silt. And then if you want to add some sand later, you can add sand to your garden, absolutely, once you have the soil texture where it should be. And the compost will actually break up those clay particles to actually loosen the clay naturally. All right, and the third way you can test your soil is by doing what's called the ribbon test. Now, the ribbon test is a really simple way that you can find out just kind of how much clay relatively you have in your soil, because clay and sand are both bad things. Too much sand is a bad thing and too much clay is a bad thing. So this is really just finding out if you at least have somewhere in kind of that Goldilocks scenario of those three. It's not going to give you an exact by any means, but it's going to give you a pretty close. So what you want to do is you want to dig down about 2 inches, as I've done. Take some soil, right? You want to take roughly about an ounce of soil, about an ounce. You want to add some water to that. Just enough water, not so it's muddy, but just so it's clumpy, a little bit muddy. I made it a little bit too muddy. But basically what you're going to do, it's not a problem if it's muddy either, it's just, it gets messier. So what you're going to do is you're going to form it into a ball. And this ball is about 1 inch in diameter. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that ball and I'm going to run it through my hands. And if you can form a ribbon, that ribbon, it's going to look a little bit like a turd, I'll be honest. But that ribbon, if it's longer than 3 inches in length before it breaks, you have too much clay. If it breaks before you even get a chance to make a ribbon, you have too much sand. So if it breaks right away, that means you have very sandy soil. If it breaks before you hit 3 inches, that means you have kind of like a clay loam, somewhere in that clay loam category. Now, I'm having a really hard time getting it to 3 inches, I'll be honest, because my soil is basically clay loam. It's basically loam or clay loam, somewhere right in there. And what I'm finding is that it is incredibly challenging to get it to that 3 inch mark. It just constantly wants to break on me. Now how far you get indicates the percentage of clay, right? So if it was sand, it would just break apart completely, too much. And also you can tell, look at the color difference, right? If I do this versus this, you can see there's a lot more. Look at the color difference too. So a little bit of fun to get your hands in the dirt, kind of just give you a rough idea. That's pretty fun. That's known as the ribbon test. All right, so those are the 3 ways you can test your soil's composition. I know I've been hinting at talking about organic material throughout this entire episode, and basically I'm going to end with the fact that organic material is separate, completely separate from sand, silt, and clay. A lot of gardeners want to simply focus on how much organic material is in their garden, and that's great. If you can bring in or generate enough compost that you don't even have to worry about sand, silt, and clay, that is fine. A garden that is made with purely compost is completely separate from sand, silt, and clay. Yes, the worms will bring up native soil, which does contain the sand, silt, and clay. Yes, you may dig in and incorporate your native soil in with a shovel, double dig, and you may incorporate the sand, silt, and clay. At that point, that may become something you're going to consider. But if you're bringing in compost or you're generating compost all the time, you're constantly topping off your beds and maintaining them, These three tests don't really mean a whole lot because compost is totally separate from sand, silt, and clay. And the reason why is because compost is organic material. And soil scientists have said that a soil that is found to be about 10% organic material content should have enough organic material that the sand, silt, and clay become irrelevant. So that's the big thing, it's the big takeaway that you need to learn from this, is that sand, silt, and clay are found in every single soil, or can be found in every single soil, but they're not as important if you have organic material. But if you don't have enough organic material, you do need to find out what percentage of sand, silt, and clay is in your soil, because that will have a huge effect on how your plants grow, how your soil behaves, and when you water, how much you should be watering, when you should be watering. It really is the foundational building block to having a healthy garden. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. If you did, make sure to hit the like button. Subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments box down below what method you use to test your soil's composition and if it worked for you. So as always, thank you guys so much, and grow bigger. Take care.